Maya, you're on.
Okay, good to be with everybody. It's nice to join you this afternoon. Yeah, I figured what I would do is start a little bit about my organization and how I came to work in this world of fiscal responsibility, and then lay out the issue and mainly have a discussion. But so the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, first problem is the name. Nobody can ever remember our name or else they laugh at it. But the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, the thing that's really unique about it, it's focused on fiscal responsibility. And I'll actually say what that is because it's not clear to everybody what that means. But it's focused on fiscal responsibility. It is bipartisan, very important. It's not about one political party or the other. I am a political independent, which I'm certain I'll talk about because it leaves me ideologically home in the city of Washington, D.C. these days. And the thing that's unique about the organization is the people who are on the board of directors are people who've served in government in high level budget positions. So people who've run the budget committees or the Congressional Budget Office, the Office of Management and Budget, the Treasury Department, the Fed. Those are the kinds of people who our board is. And that gives us a unique credibility, particularly when dealing with lawmakers, that we kind of are not just a removed think tank talking about sort of preaching about things we should do, but also filled with some political realists who know how hard it is to actually do things that are fiscally responsible. And the way I got into it, grew up in Washington, D.C., and never thought I would end up back here because I don't care for politics. I actually don't understand why we separate ourselves into two teams and spend more energy beating each other up than trying to run the country. I love public policy. I went to the Kennedy School of Government and studied policy and spreadsheets and metrics and all sorts of wonky things. That's what I really like. So I didn't think I'd come back to DC and work in the world of politics, but I ended up coming back to work at a think tank, the Brookings Institution. Fascinating job. I was choosing between that and going to be a bartender in London. I'm still not sure that I made the right choice, but it was a terrific job. Went to work on Wall Street because I wanted to apply research to the private sector. Found the boring and not motivating, but I think those early jobs we all probably found are more about figuring out what you don't want to do than what you do necessarily want to do. And while I was there, I looked at how markets were responding to what was going on in Washington. And I became really interested in the budget deficits, read more about them. This was in the mid 90s. And they were very small compared to where they are now. But I really started to think, oh, this seems bad. Like I sort of trust the government to do the right thing. But I really was concerned that we were borrowing not for economic reasons, but because it was politically convenient. And so I think one of the tricks of government, especially in a polarized political environment, is how you set up systems that will at least guide the right process. And it seemed to me that the system that was allowing us to borrow for no good reason wasn't the right system. So came over, ran this organization, have been here forever, really long time. You know, I remember because it's when my first kid was born. I basically found out I was pregnant and accepted the job in the same day. And now that first kid is a senior in high school. So it's been a while, but I love the job. Actually, I'm going to say, if anybody, when I'm talking, wants to jump in, I think it's totally, unmute yourself and come pop into the conversation. Otherwise, we can do things at the end. But if there are thoughts or ideas as we're talking, I find the conversation much more interesting.
Okay, let me just also comment that if you wanted to put something in the chat, then we can pick that up. And if we want to do that on behalf of you, we can ask the question.
Yeah, you guys can do that. I won't read the chat because I find multitasking keeps me unfocused and the world of multitasking is driving me kind of crazy, but yeah, feel free to chat. Okay, let me jump into the issue. And here is what I would like to talk about. I think I basically want to cover sort of an overview of the fiscal situation, where we are, how we got here, why it matters, because one of the biggest issues is actually to care about this issue, because it's certainly not one that really connects with people on their day-to-day life. And then, excuse me, we can talk a little bit about what's going on now, because there's so much in the news with the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill, potential government shutdown, debt ceiling. Those are all right in our area. So we can talk a lot more about current events. And then I also want to make sure I do a little bit on what we might do to fix the problem, because I am one of the most depressing speakers around. I always try to hope that I go to conferences before somebody who's like the inspirational speaker, because I'm a downer and I'm a pessimist. It's hard to work on this issue when I'm so concerned that we're not going to get it right. But I don't like to just complain about it. I like to show how many different solutions there are. And then I really, at this point, think what we're facing is a political problem, not a policy problem, because we know how to fix this situation of fiscal policy if we only have the political will. Okay, so okay, let me define fiscal responsibility, because it's not a balanced budget group. And in fact, balanced budgets are really not important. In particular, number 0 doesn't actually mean anything other than it's helpful for the country to know, oh, we're borrowing more, we're spending more than we're bringing in taxes, or less. So budgets, surpluses and deficits are easy to understand. 0 seems like a sensible metric, but it's not really. And we've just gone through the experience reminding us why it's not. Because at a moment like COVID, not only do you want to borrow because you have a huge national emergency, you need to borrow because the economy isn't going to, you need to fill in the missing portion in the economy. So if your GDP, it could be potential GDP, it's an important time to borrow so that you can fill that in and help growth resume, or at least stay closer to normal than it otherwise would, mitigate a recession. So there's lots of times you want to borrow. Sorry for all my moving around. Gotta get comfortable. There's lots of times you want to borrow, but the problem is when your economy is strong, you don't want to borrow. You actually want to pay for things. And if your debt's on an unsustainable trajectory, which I will describe that we are on, you actually want to do a little bit more than just paying for what you're doing. You want to put in place a plan that makes your debt not grow faster than GDP. So basically, I would say the metric one cares about is the budget balanced or not. Are you on a trajectory where your debt is going faster than the overall economy? Because that's impossible to sustain. And that is kind of a sign that you are throwing these hard choices out into the future rather than taking them today. So where are we? Right now, our debt is about 100% of GDP. And that is near the record in this country. The highest is ever was 106% or 106% of GDP right after World War II. And of course, the difference was we'd fought a world war, and that number came down to about balance in about 4 or 5 years afterwards, because quickly, right after the war was over, we went back. We had a huge demographic boom. We had an economic growth boom. We were bringing the spending way down. Revenues were coming up. So everything came together, and that situation was remedied really quickly. The difference today is at 100% of GDP, we're actually expected to get to that 106% within the decade, beating the record, so the highest ever without it being in the midst of a world war. And that's if we do nothing new. If we are to do some policies that actually seem quite past some of the things the president is talking about, do so without gimmicks. And the gimmicks that I'm referring to are a lot of the policies and the plans that are being discussed would be arbitrarily cut off to color, but if you actually extended them as politicians want to, and if you extended the tax cuts from the Trump era as they plan to, all of those policies, we'd then be at debt to GDP at about 125% at the end of the decade, far exceeding where we've ever been. And this is growing faster than the economy. And one of the things you look at is your interest payments. Interest payments in this country are about $300 billion a year. That's one of our biggest programs. I think it's about the 5th biggest program. That's the equivalent of costing $2,500 per household every single year. And they are projected to triple over the next decade. And that's with interest rates really low. You'll hear a lot of, don't worry, interest rates are low. We should be borrowing for so many things. For those who say that, don't worry, we are borrowing. There's a ton of borrowing already planned. And the interest payments, which you need to keep an eye on, are growing. And that is another sign that you're on an unsustainable course. So if we do nothing that would increase the national debt, we will borrow another $13 trillion over the next decade. That's already baked in. That's already into the structural deficit situation. So a lot of times you'll hear people making the case that we should be borrowing. And it's kind of like, there are lots of reasons. One could say if you had a healthy balance sheet, if we are structurally already for what we're spending, there are some things that would make sense to borrow for, but we're already absorbing that money and using it. We've already planned to borrow it. So it's one of those lessons of all the borrowing of the past decades actually leaves us in a much more constrained position now. It also leaves us worse off now, but you don't know it. You know how you never know what the counterfactual is. We don't know what shape we would have been in if we hadn't borrowed so much for the past years and decades. But every theory shows you that we would have had a higher economy, higher wages, higher standard of living. And so what we're doing is we're absorbing that higher standard of living in the short term and shortchanging it in the long term. In many ways, that used to sort of feel sensible because there was the belief every generation will be better off than the previous one. So in some ways, you're borrowing from that future generation. But that's no longer true. Neither is it true economically, or I think kind of, I don't know, state of the world. But now it's clear that future generations are not going to have a growing standard of living in terms of the track that we're right now. And it certainly seems they're going to face many more grave dangers and challenges than we had been anticipating. There was those decades there where it felt like the world was relatively stable and peaceful and therefore more prosperous. That has been kind of, that sense of security has been erased. And there's now so many more things to be concerned about on the geopolitical stage, which is another one of the reasons you have to be cognizant of your fiscal state. So are there any questions on the basic numbers? I mean, the problem with trillions and even billions is they're just really, really big. You can't conceive of them. You can't make sense of them. We have a tool that I built. We have a lot of interactive tools because I think it's really interesting to go through to become more familiar with this in a way that personalizes it. So you can always go to CRFB, our website, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, CRFB, and look at the interactive tools. But one I really like is the one I just use that interest number from, but it's breaking down all the spending and taxes and new initiatives, either by per person, per taxpayer, or per household. But it helps you get a sense of the scale of what these programs actually are, minus the trillions, which obviously don't really mean anything to any of us. It also gives you different exercises where you can say how you would fix the problem, how you would fix security, look at how much we spend on all of these different programs per person. Would you spend more or less? There's a lot of interesting things to play around. So please, if you find that interesting, take a look at them. One other thing on the fiscal picture where we are right now, there are a number of government trust funds that are heading towards insolvency. And the trustees of Social Security and Medicare just came out, I think 2 weeks ago, with their annual report, making the projections that the HI, hospital insurance, Part A of Medicare, is going to be insolvent within 5 years. And Social Security is set to be insolvent in 2034. That's when today's 54-year-olds are starting to retire. And what happens then is there is an abrupt across the board cut of every single person's benefits of 22%. That's the new 54-year-old today, new retiree then. That's the 95-year-old widow who is depending for 100% of her income on Social Security. That's Bill Gates, it's everybody. So instead of sort of going through, and what we should have done to thought about, how do you prepare for Social Security's impending insolvency and what changes do you make? It's not rocket science. I did my master's thesis on it about 1 million years ago. And there's another tool where you can look at that and figure out how you'd fix it. A number of members of Congress have gone through and made Social Security reform plans from the tool. There's lots of choices. None, in fact, are wrong or right. One of the things I think we really have to get our arms around is we all have different policy preferences. One of you might want to fix Social Security by raising the taxes and raising the retirement age. Somebody else might want to means test it. The truth is you kind of have to do all of them to get it done, but there's lots of different preferences about how to fix the system. What should not be permitted is to continue to ignore that the trustees are telling us to fix it. That to me is kind of reflective of the brokenness of our governance system right now, where we have huge impending problems, not just the debt, but Social Security, Medicare, Highway Trust Fund, and every year Congress, barely can get its act together and certainly isn't addressing these problems. And just on my frustration with the budget process and how we're failing to do these things, we actually know a budget in place most years. We don't have a working budget in place this year. We haven't passed one for next year. The end of the fiscal year is in September. We were supposed to have passed a budget in April. Neither of the budget committees came out with budgets, let alone the work of the Senate and the House reconciling them. And this is becoming commonplace, that we have with the single biggest economy in the world, and we are operating without a budget in place more often than not. That is the kind of thing that we should have built into this system a situation where that is permissible. We certainly shouldn't be plowing forward and borrowing trillions, even billions of dollars without an actual budget in place. Okay, so let me move on to why we should think about it. There's so many reasons, right? The first is economic, that excess levels of national debt slows your economic growth. Every year, little bits of lower growth lead to high changes in standard of living over time, crowding out of the private sector. Even with really low interest rates, we actually still have crowding out. Doesn't bother me so much now the way it did when rates were higher, but economically it has an effect on your capital stock. And so it means, again, lower standard of living in the future. Second, like we just saw during COVID, it's so important to be able to borrow during emergencies, but if you're borrowing non-emergencies, and we're expecting to borrow $1 to $2 trillion a year over the next decade, that's how much is built into the budget structurally. If you're borrowing during non-emergencies, you don't know if when the next emergency comes along, if you will be able to borrow. And if COVID had not allowed us, if that period we hadn't been able to borrow at low rates, our economy would not have sustained it nearly as well as it did. And obviously, I don't mean to make light of how immense, a huge travesty, tragedy, and crisis COVID has been. But thank goodness our economy didn't tank for a longer amount of time. And overall, most people's incomes due to the response were actually higher, not lower during COVID. That's pretty remarkable. That's because we were able to borrow so much. But if we keep borrowing when times are normal, now, next year, following years, that is going to become a problem. And it's also, we are dependent on the lending from foreigners. 40% of our borrowing comes from abroad. The two biggest owners of our debt are Japan and China. We know that our relationship with China is quite tense right now. And we know, though it's not very often, that one of the tools in the toolbox of this conflict, economic conflict, is China could talk about not coming to a US Treasury auction or flood the market with $1 trillion of treasuries it owns. It would hurt China, probably more than it would hurt us. But given that we have sort of different approaches to this economic Cold War, whatever it is that one would describe that we're in, that is a tool that represents a vulnerability that we have allowed ourselves, and we continue to. So you want to be able to borrow during emergencies. It's not clear that we will always be able to. You also want to make sure that you don't have this become a national security threat. And Admiral Mullen and Dan Coates and others have said the single biggest security threat to the United States of America is our national debt. And this is a self-imposed vulnerability. We can't control a lot of the skirmishes and tensions around the world, but to have ourselves them weaker and dependent, that is pretty frightening to me. And I think that this national security threat is actually one that is catching up to and maybe going to surpass the economic threat, depending on what else is going on in the rest of the world. I guess the final thing I would say in terms of why it matters is it's time to revamp our budget. There are so many things in our budget that don't make sense. I could ask you how much you think we spend on different things, and I can almost promise you that the way we allocate the budget is very different than you would think it is or should be. And again, these tools are a great one to go to. There's a couple of quizzes there and places which you can look at how you think the budget should be allocated, where you'll see the differences, or maybe you'll find that this is exactly what you want, but I doubt it. But particularly things like our social contract, we need to update our social contract. We have Social Security and Medicare that are really focused on the biggest threats of the past, healthcare and retirement, neither of which are solvent. But what we haven't done is updated the social contract to understand how much the world has changed. And things like, I guess the one I think of a lot is lifelong learning. You no longer go into the workforce at 18 or 22 or 27 and think that your skills will keep you relevant for your working career. Not even close. basically you're irrelevant by the time you're 29 if you're not staying current on technological innovations. And this is changing constantly. And so with the huge interaction between technology and professionalism, we have to have some forms of lifelong learning. Otherwise, you're already seeing this. What used to be assumed was you were going to make more in every decade of your life. And part of our economic trajectory assumes a growing wage base for our families, and think about how you're going to save in that way. That's going to change. 20-year-olds can contribute a lot more than 50-year-olds in some areas, and yet they're compensated much lower. This is going to shift around. We're going to see huge changes there. And one of the answers is we're all going to have to stay as current in our understanding of technology and new ways of doing things, even as the pace of change speeds up from where it used to be. Okay, I think I'm going to not talk about the current moment, except I'd rather start the discussion, have people ask questions as what they're interested in. But again, we have a huge bipartisan infrastructure bill. We have a huge bill that's going through reconciliation, which means it can be passed Democratic only without a filibuster. But there's some constraints there that I can talk about. We have the end of the fiscal year, which could not unlikely lead to a government shutdown. And we have hitting the debt ceiling, which could lead to a default. Those are different things, government shutdown and default, even though the press confuses them all the time. So why don't I stop there and see if there's specific things people would be interested in talking about?
Well, let me take the first one if I can.
Okay.
One of the obvious issues, we're old enough that many of us have vague memories, at least, of the Eisenhower years. And all you have to do is look at the tax structure then and basically say, gee, you can fix the problem really easily. All you have to do is go back to our most successful years when the taxes were substantially higher. Okay. And yet what we are living with now is a major tax reduction in good years done by the previous administration. So on one side, I've got this whole stack of issues: social, climate change, infrastructure, you can list them all day. And on the other side, I've got nobody wants their taxes to go up. And one of the results of that is it's almost impossible. Okay. How do you balance the two? Because unless you can balance, I don't know where you can cut massive amounts out of a budget that is predominantly transfer payments. Okay, so what is it you can do other than raise taxes?
Okay, so I start with as I said, sort of on Social Security, but the general acceptance that we are a diverse, very diverse country when it comes to our policy preferences. And the biggest divides between Republicans and Democrats, to generalize crassly, is the preference for the size of government. Some people want bigger government, some people want smaller government. One interesting thing is that without fiscal constraints, people don't actually understand what that means. So we had huge tax cuts, 2017, which our organization was highly, highly against because they added $2 trillion to the national debt. And what was particularly ironic in all of that is that if what you want is smaller government, you don't cut taxes, you cut spending. And there was virtually no spending cuts that went as a part of that bill. And yet people talked about it making government smaller. Actually, no, that makes government bigger because you've added to the debt and that's added to your interest payments. But there are people who think, no, we should cut government spending. And I guess where I disagree with you is certainly there's lots of places we could cut government spending. And the main things that you would do is you would put a cap on the growth of how much government grows every year. So I think the Biden administration on discretionary spending, which is 1/3 of the budget, suggested overall growth that could be in the double digits. I think it was even above 15%, but for this year. That's a huge amount of growth. You might want it, you might not want it, but you certainly don't need to have that. And so limiting the growth of the budget is one area where you can certainly control spending. A second area is there things that have become outdated, unnecessary, or funneling resources where we don't need them. Farm subsidies, for instance, Tennessee Valley Authority. There's lots of different things people disagree about. Third thing is looking at what's working and what's not. So if we look at this infrastructure bill, I promise you, we're going to find a whole lot of infrastructure resources that go to places for political reasons, not because they'll have high returns. So if we had more oversight and more evaluation of where the returns would actually be higher, or who we're giving money to, that is a way that is having high returns, that extra rigor would be helpful. And then the last thing is, yes, so much of our budget is transfer payments, and people can have differences on what they think those transfer payments should look like. One is that you should scale back welfare. Another is that you should means test universal welfare. So there's some programs that are targeted to low income people, and there's some programs that are universal. Everybody gets them. And one of the very popular ideas whenever I go out and talk is, can we scale back the universality so that we don't have benefits that are going to people who don't need them as much? Contentious, but that's on the spending side. So I'm not saying those are right or wrong, because I don't say that. I don't believe in right or wrong, but I'm saying there's lots of ways to scale back spending. If we don't want to, we absolutely need to raise revenues. And if we're going to raise revenues, there's a couple of buckets of ways to do it. There's what Biden has talked about, which is raising revenues only on families making over $400,000. Those are higher income taxes, corporate taxes, depending on how you think that's passed through, wealth taxes, capital gains, step-up basis at death, certain kinds of transaction taxes. So there's a lot of options there. Oh, most importantly, getting rid of tax breaks. We have about $1.5 trillion in tax breaks per year. Very popular: healthcare exclusion, home mortgage interest deduction, charitable deductions, but all of those are highly regressive. So if you want to tax the well-off more, you can scale back some of those tax breaks. The second bucket is broad-based taxes. So sales taxes, a VAT, a carbon tax, taxes that do hit the middle class. And the reason I think it's important to discuss those is the promise that we're fix all of our debt and pay for these very bold new initiatives, just taxing the wealthy. Those numbers are impossible. I testified for the budget committees a couple months ago, and we went through, like, if you want to just pay for the reconciliation bill that's out there right now, $3.5 trillion, you could do that with taxes on just people making over $400,000. You could do a little bit more, but you couldn't do that and stabilize the debt at the same time with anything that's politically realistic. And you certainly couldn't do it if you add in new items such as the Green New Deal or college for all, or some of the bigger ticket items that have been discussed that aren't with momentum now. But if you're talking about those, you can't. So I think the most important thing in all of this is to tie the two together. I am neutral on whether we should have more government, less government. I mean, I'm not in my personal feelings, but they're irrelevant to my role. But if what you do is say, here's the thing you want, here's how much it will cost, are you willing to pay for it? Here's the tax cut you want, here's the spending you're going to have to cut to go along with that. Are you willing to do that? That test would bring us a lot closer together and stop the kind of crazy fighting about huge tax cuts that aren't paid for and then huge spending programs that aren't paid for. And one final thing, the 3 years before COVID, under the Trump administration, we added $4.7 trillion to the debt. That's how much we passed in programs that there was zero justification for them to add to the debt. The economy was incredibly strong. Now, of that 4.7 trillion, half of it was tax cuts and half of it was spending increases. And of the tax cuts, 2 trillion were supported by just Republicans. Another 500 billion were bipartisan in nature. And all the spending programs were bipartisan. So it's, we just don't pay for things anymore at all. Basically, what's happened is the norm is not to pay for new policies. And I'm really, really impressed that the Biden administration has put out we are going to pay for the new spending that we're passing. We'll see if they're able to hold that line. But the economy is too strong. In fact, right? Inflation is the real risk now on the other side to talk about borrowing trillions more. And so it's really good they're trying to do that. But my sense is as this gets negotiated, those pay-fors are going to disappear. But anyhow, George, I do slightly agree with you. No, taxes aren't the only answer. I think realistically, it's going to be more tax heavy than spending cut heavy. But it's more about whether somebody's consistent with the view of government they have and the amount of government they want. Are they actually willing to pay for it?
Well, it also has to do, doesn't it, with wanting everybody else's ox to be gored, but not mine. Okay.
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody on this call is on Social Security, I'm sure. And I'm sure the question we would have would be, is our Social Security going to be safe? Without thinking through the possibility that if it's means tested, by definition, some of our Social Security will go away.
So it is so true how much this is about asking someone else to do that. I mean, the notion of shared sacrifice is something we as a nation seem to have lost. And that's really been a while. And I think it's also been eroded with the loss of trust we have for our leaders and each other, where it's at this point, I still believe people would basically say like, yeah, we're going to fix Social Security. We're going to fix the debt. I'm in. If they were financially able to be. I mean, some people are really struggling and you wouldn't expect them to say, yeah, I'll pay higher taxes or get rid of some of my benefits. But if you're comfortable enough, I think people would say, I'm in, if they trusted that that money would actually go to what it was said it was going to, and they weren't the only one who was contributing, right? Like you read the news about the tax gap and people whose money is being hidden overseas and corporations that aren't paying what they're supposed to, and you lose all this trust. And so, I think that has continued to build momentum, this feeling of I'm not in and someone else should pay for this. And especially with more millionaires and billionaires, quote unquote, it seems like there's more people you can point to who you can shift all this to. You can shift some of this to, but there's actually not enough money there to pay for all the things we're talking about. Social Security, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Social Security specifically. And so my father is always the first person who's like, you keep your hands off my Social Security, Maya. I remember when he found out his retirement age was not 65 because the age is going up really gradually to 67, but it was like 65 in 4 months. And he called me up furious. And I was like, just by the way, Dad, this is a law that passed in 1983. I think I was in 4th grade, so it's not my fault. But you know, like, I'm really sorry you have to work 4 extra months. No, those of you who are on Social Security actually wouldn't be affected. That's not for a policy justification, because I think, I'll say something I do personally think. I think it will be great to say to Warren Buffett or Donald Trump or anybody else who just clearly doesn't need Social Security, like, hey, how about you don't collect it and goes back into the system? But that's not happening. There is no politician who, when Social Security reforms finally happen, is going to touch current retirees or even close to retirees. It's always been a broad-based political promise that no one's willing to go anywhere near that. So even if it's means testing, the way that would work is phasing in for new retirees, say people who are under 55 or 50. Those years keep. So, and I think there's a lot of scaremongering around Social Security as well, where have chosen not to fix it because they prefer to use it as a bludgeon against each other. And you'll hear a ton of like, people are trying to steal your Social Security or slash benefits or all of those things. Political promise, if it were better known, is probably helpful.
Okay, let me tackle 3 new questions.
Good.
First one, the House just turned down the possibility of having Medicare renegotiate what it pays for drugs. Okay, would you care to comment on that?
Sure, I'm a big believer in everything that raises revenues or reduces spending are the things we should be focusing. The hardest things to do are the best ones for the budget. But in my mind, that's a pretty smart bill, and I'm discouraged to see it not as a part of this. There is a real tension between lower prices and lower innovation, but I think that tension is exaggerated. And I think it's a pretty well thought out bill. So yeah, there are 3 members who objected to it. So it's not moving in committee. I bet you it comes back though. There's actually a plan to bring it back. So it's still in play.
We'll hope that's true. Second question. The stock market and the bond markets don't seem to be reflecting the concerns you have. Okay.
Not at all. Let me go back to Medicare for one thing, because one thing
Yeah.
to remember is that there is the huge prescription drug program that's part of Medicare now that was put in, I guess, 15 years ago. And one thing that's sort of notable about that program, it wasn't paid for. So that was a huge borrowed program. So the prescription drug program that exists is and it's another benefit that people are getting that they didn't actually contribute to in their working years. So there is already a big subsidy for prescription drugs. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do more, but I know it's to your point of sort of people are very protective of the things that they have, but it's just also helpful to remember that a lot of these benefits are things that are transfer payments that we're choosing to make, but they're coming at expenses from other things.
And your options, let me go back to that one before we go to the stock market. So your options for fixing Medicare are basically A and B. What are they?
Oh, the best things that you can do. Well, Medicare has always, oh gosh, Social Security is so much easier than Medicare. The best things you have to do for Medicare is control overall healthcare costs. And Medicare can be a huge piece of negotiating prices it's willing to pay in terms of impacting that. But basically, you have to break the chokehold that all the different associations in our massive healthcare industry have on how things work. You need to increase price transparency. You need to equalize costs across different locations. Like you have pay different things, whether you're in a hospital or a private healthcare facility. You need to equalize costs. You need to make them transparent. You need to allow for more competition. You need to have more swift changes so that you're paying for outcomes rather than procedures in as many ways as possible. And you need to use price controls in some places where it is determined that the loss of innovation that comes with that is worth it. And I think that exists in many places.
Okay. So
but I
back
tend to
stock
think
market.
of Medicare and the whole healthcare industry as pretty important and linked. But the problem is it's the medical association, it's the hospital association, it's the insurers, it's every one of the components of the industry that aren't allowing for this market to work in any way close to the way another market would function. And yet it's not regulated enough as a non-functioning market.
And then to add to it all, we have the new generation of biological solutions that are coming in at tens of thousands of dollars per year. So we'll skip that. Let's go to the stock market. What's happening in your mind in the stock market and bond markets? So from our side, it looks totally irrational given what you have talked about.
I think we are in a terrifying bubble that we don't know when it's going to burst. And the problem with bubbles is if you sit back and say, well, this is a bubble, I'm not getting into this, you can miss a huge run up, right? You can miss years of stock market appreciation and make the wrong calls in bonds. We have a very unusual situation that's affected by trends, artificial changes, and changes in the global economy. The trends are aging and growing income inequality. Both of those have pushed interest rates much lower. And there was a really interesting paper at Jackson Hole this year. Jackson Hole is the meeting where all the monetary policy experts work. And one of the papers showed how growing income inequality has definitely contributed to the decline in interest rates, which is causing the huge run up in the stock market and the bubble, both in the markets and commodities. So income inequality and the aging of the population, because we shift as we get older into how we're investing and whether we're consuming more or saving more and when pulling out of the markets. The second trend is, of course, quantitative easing and the actions of the Fed, not just here, but around the world. And so bringing down interest rates, committing to keep them down, quantitative easing, the running up of the balance sheets of the Fed to the trillions, all of those are keeping rates low. And the real question is there actual fiscal space, or is that being kept down by the actions of the Fed? And it appears that most of it is Fed driven, that there's not as much demand for a lot of the stock for the bond issuances throughout COVID. Most of that was absorbed by the Fed. And the third issue is globalization. The fact is there used to be a homeward bias where you mainly lent to your own country. And that was always hard in the US because we had very low saving rates. But with globalization, we have borrowed more from other countries. And the US has massively benefited from the fact that we are the reserve currency and the safe haven. And even like in 2008-9, when we screwed up the global economy, people wanted to buy our debt. The problem is we are not acting like a country that is going to keep that privilege for very long. And there is massive competition from other countries to be the reserve currency. And the more we show political instability, which unfortunately and frighteningly we're showing a good deal, the more even the EU becomes more likely to give us at least a run for our money or preserve another alternative. And if there's less demand for our currency, that artificial propping up doesn't last. So I would argue none of this has to do with the fundamentals. And I would also argue that the bond market and the stock market miss basic every crisis. They happen when they happen. And so markets, which are, we all know this, incredibly short-term focused. Earnings are on the quarters or the weeks. You know, it's no longer long-term value at all in terms of how we guide our finance. That is leading to what is a huge bubble. But when it will change, I could not tell you. This for another decade without a problem. What I would caution is, let's not be the country that finds out what our own tipping point, even as the reserve currency, is. A very painful and unnecessary thing to find out.
Okay, we all can think about situations like the highway tax, where the tax pays for something else. Okay, can you give us any innovative examples of where there is the possibility of tying an income stream to an expense that the government should have?
Oh, I'll give you one which I can't believe we're doing. How about a carbon tax to help with climate? I mean, this is a no-brainer, and the thing I'm really mad at right now is that through reconciliation, we're not trying to pass a carbon tax. So carbon tax for climate, in my mind, no-brainer. Other things that people have talked about, should we create a national VAT that would go for our healthcare system? Because right now our healthcare system, back to like how you'd fix Medicare, because that's the hardest question you'll ever ask me or anyone. Fixing the healthcare system is just brutal. But one of the things we could do is if we had a dedicated tax to overall healthcare, that would create a budget. And once you have a budget, the beauty, you can tell, I love this. But once you have a budget, the beauty of it is it pushes you to actually try to make some choices. If you don't, if everything's pretend free, it's really not, just shifts the cost to where you can't see it. You never try to find those efficiencies. So I think a dedicated tax for healthcare is an intriguing idea. The problem with dedicated taxes, and it's really good on highway, I think that makes a lot of sense. The problem with them is it also leaves out direct funding for things that are really important also. Public investments, let's say human capital in the next generation. I think we want being supportive of paying for education, or it is a public good in many ways that you would want more broad support than just a tax that is dedicated towards it and only some people supporting that idea. Or better yet, like basic research. You know, it's hard to have a dedicated tax towards that. People, I'm not saying this well, people will overvalue the checks that come to them and undervalue the longer term investments that a country makes. And that's why both companies and countries tend to cut their public investments sooner, because they want to hold on to, like, I'm sending you a check, and if I tell you I'm not, you're going to be very angry at me. But if I cut funding for cancer research, pollution abatement, those different things, you're not going to be as invested in that. And so I like the idea of dedicated taxes, but I don't always love it because I'm worried about the lack of emphasis on investments that might lead to. And one of the big beliefs I have is that our budget is way too focused on consumption, about 86%, and way under focused on investment at about 14%. And I would like to see those switched massively.
So structural, without necessarily the regard to whether or not it's politically possible, if you could restructure the nature of how the government approves its budget, its financing, its borrow, all that stuff, what kind of structural changes would your group actually be recommending?
So it's like budget process rules, the kinds of changes there.
Yeah.
That's a fun question. First off, a lot of times when people talk about structure, they're doing it to avoid actual real choices. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about a balanced budget amendment. And I'm not a big fan. I'm not really opposed. I'm okay, but I'll always turn to members of Congress, always turn to them and be like, okay, and how would you balance the? Oh, no, well, I wouldn't tell you till it's passed. Like, I don't like process to replace the actual, here's the realization. It's hard to pay for things. We need to pay for things. The family, we have the ability to tax. There are many differences, but the whole like people not thinking about paying for things, I think is a real problem. Here's the first thing I would do. I would change a lot of the ways that this is party's responsibility. If you've read about Mitch McConnell right now saying Democrats are in charge, so they have to lift the debt ceiling. Like, how about you're all in charge because you're voted to be the members of Congress? Again, I'm a homeless independent, but I really don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I know that we hired you to run the country, and I think you should vote that we not default. I just think that that is like a basic no-brainer in terms of responsibility. Now, you can vote in a way where you say, I'm not going to permit more borrowing, but you can't default for the past. So what I would do is the first thing is I would require every member of Congress to support a budget. I think there needs to be a blueprint they all attach themselves to, and not a like, oh, well, the other guys are in charge, or, oh, we're not going to put a budget in place. I think everybody should weigh in on, this is what I want to spend, and this is how I pay for it. And they can either show their own, or they can support one of the ones that exists. But the whole, like, I got no plan doesn't work for me. And I'd also even put that in place for any trust fund that is projected to become insolvent. I don't think it's acceptable for members of Congress to not have an idea for Social Security or Medicare or highway or any of those things. So you have to have a plan. The second thing is I would have fiscal metrics. So if you pass a budget, there is no limit on how much you can borrow. And I think there should be, not during wars, not during emergencies, not during recessions. But I think when the economy is strong, we should limit how much borrowing there is. And there's some really neat plans. Our group has come out with them, but basically saying there should be a plan for debt targets. So our debt's 101% of GDP at the end of the year. There should be a plan. Instead of it going to that 107% of GDP, it's going to go down to 95% of GDP over the next decade. And every budget you put out has to meet that metric. Again, total freedom on how you do it, but you can't say, I don't want any constraint at all. A third change I would do is I'd support something that Senator Langford and Senator Hassan have. There are a bunch of bills on this, but an auto CR, which just means we're going to stop having government shutdowns, that they can't pass the spending bills by the end of the month, which is possible because they act like kindergartners and they shut down the government, which is like, talk about making ourselves a laughing stock. Like, none of us love everyone we work with. We don't shut down our offices because we're fighting. But an auto CR just means government would automatically be funded at the same level, something, or you could do a haircut if you want it to be punitive, the same level, a small increase if you want it not to be punitive, but something so we don't shut down. And I mean, there's other things I would do. They don't know what they're voting on. I would never, ever force these votes before a score from the congressional budget comes out, before people actually have time to find out what's in the bills. I think the ongoing consolidation of power of political leadership so that the rank and file members don't know what's in the bills and end up just following their parties contributes to more polarization and less focus on policy. I would love to see some people I love bipartisanship. I think all individuals, and that just because you think one thing on foreign policy doesn't mean you definitely think another thing on social policy or another thing on economic policy. I think if we were functioning on different policy areas, we'd have different coalitions of supporters working together on them. But I'd like to see them spend a ton more time building an understanding of the policy and working on compromise. I run some dinner groups for members of Congress. One is on technology, the economy, and capitalism, just where they can take an hour or two, not worry about fundraising, because I don't give a dime to politics, and that's gonna be my next change. But actually some of these big issues that I think are around where they can have discussions and bring in speakers and think about them. So give them more time to have that. I'd take money out of politics. I don't know how you do it anymore, but I think it's corrupt. I think it's bribery and terrible, terrible influences. And I'm shocked that we allow ourselves to do it. And likewise, this city, DC, has entire industries based on influence, and they're wrong. It shouldn't work this way. So I try to do as much as I could on campaign finance reform and ethics and government. But the main thing is there should be a fiscal objective. You shouldn't be able to borrow unfettered. And every lawmaker should have a budget that they support so they could actually be forced to deal with the trade-offs in budgeting. There's tons others, but those are some.
Okay, one final question, unless another one comes in. If you were to look around the world and say, boy, this country really is doing a great job, what country would you show me?
I always think Australia and New Zealand are doing a really good job. They budget in a way that's very transparent. And I think both of them have these long-term budgets. And in fact, they have sort of there's an idea we have called the state of the fiscal state of the nation, where for one day, there'd be an announcement of the overall fiscal health of the country and the president would have to report on it. Australia, those ideas have come from Australia and New Zealand, a little bit Canada, where what they're doing is they make transparent how every choice they are making would affect the budget today and in the future. And then they look at generational impact, because there's a real pressure to focus on the short term instead of the long term. So anything that you can do that switches that up and encourages them to take the future well-being as well as the current well-being, that's the kind of, I would put pressures in to build for that.
Okay, great. Maya, I cannot thank you enough for your insights. I wish you had more influence.
Me too.
We all get so frustrated because this system we have built has somehow now moved away from the discussion and democracy I remembered into this amazing conflict that's going on. So we have your website. I think we'll put it on the chat, but it's crfb.org. And
games, I know they don't sound fun, but I think they're really fun. I think they do a nice job of straddling educational and kind of fun. So if you're at all interested in that, which you must be because it's a Sunday morning your time and you guys have come out for a budget discussion, take a look at them and feel free to also send me your thoughts or ideas on them. Great. We share the results with members of Congress as well.
Well, we most appreciate you taking the time. And a reminder to everybody, next week is Ernie Rose, and look at his history and documentaries. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.